So we've covered Hebrews and James. Now we're on to 1st and 2nd Peter. So the date of 1st Peter is probably the mid-60s. It's common to think that it was during the persecution under Nero. If we know from church history, Nero killed a lot of Christians, including, according to tradition, Peter and Paul. But when you look at the type of persecution happening in 1st Peter, it doesn't seem to be the level of Nero's persecution. Rather, it seems that people are slandering Christians, speaking poorly of them, but not yet killing them. So I wouldn't quite say it's all the way to Nero. It's more likely, in my mind, around the early 60s, not the mid 60s, but probably leading up to Nero's persecution. In this book, we see a call to holiness. We see this throughout the book about how God's people are to be holy in their conduct. The context of 1 Peter is persecution that arises from outside of the church. Namely, these are non-Christians who begin to persecute Christians by slandering them and speaking ill of them. And Peter's philosophy for how they're to undergo persecution is they are to be holy and blameless. And as they live holy and blameless lives, they will put their persecutors to shame by their conduct. So this is what they're to do. They're to live holy lives. But when we talk about their ontology, what does it mean to be a Christian according to 1 Peter? We see in 1 Peter 2:9 him saying these words, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." Notice these words. And if you remember, these are actually really similar to Exodus 19. Like, what does it mean to be the nation of Israel according to Exodus 19 is that we are God's treasured people. We are a royal priesthood. We are a kingdom of priests. And those words are now being recycled and reused in Peter. And I think what Peter's saying is that now the church is the true Israel of God. That's who we are. We are God's chosen race. We are his people. A people from all ethnicities brought together by Jesus. We are a royal priesthood, a holy nation devoted to God, a people for his own possession. Now notice the purpose of this. Like, why has God saved us? Why has he saved us? So that we may proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Like, who we are as God's people is deeply connected to what we do as God's people. God saved Abraham for a purpose, to bless the nations. God made Adam with a purpose, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. God saved Israel for this purpose, and he is saving you and me for this purpose. Like, you have a purpose, and it is to proclaim the excellencies of our King. In fact, what we see happening in 1 Peter is a lot of priestly language, namely, we are a royal priesthood. So, what sacrifice do we offer? We learn about this in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. And what it seems to indicate is the sacrifice we offer is the words of praise, the words of the gospel, the excellencies of the one who called us out of darkness into his light. This is the priestly offering we offer as God's people, an offering of thanksgiving. You know, we are truly called to live differently. We are to move past our old life, leave our past behind. We're no longer to live like the Gentiles. We learn about this in Peter where it says, like, it's been enough time to party and get drunk and to live for the passions of the flesh. It's been enough time. We are now to live differently. And when we think about persecution, Peter is clear, like, we are going to be persecuted. In fact, what he talks about is that not only does the Christian life correspond to suffering, it actually causes suffering. So you've often heard Christian pastors talk about how Christianity will let you live your best life now and things like this. And to be clear, there's lots of joy and peace and happiness in the Christian life. But according to Peter, your life as a Christian will produce a certain quantifiable amount of suffering. But the idea in 1 Peter is Jesus is worth it. That's what we see happening. So Peter in 1 Peter is calling us to live differently because Jesus is worth it. This is what Jesus did. I mean, Jesus suffered for us, right? Like he himself bore our iniquities. He himself, according to Peter in verse 13, suffered for us. And we are to now suffer likewise. It's a glorious thing in 1 Peter that we see that, like, when we suffer as Christians, when we are made fun of and slandered because people laugh at what we believe, when they hurt us or harm us, if they confiscate our property, like, we are actually experiencing deeper intimacy with Jesus because he suffered for righteousness' sake too. When we suffer for righteousness' sake, not when we suffer as a sinner, but when we suffer as a Christian, we are identifying with Christ, who likewise suffered for righteousness' sake. And that is a glorious thing. You know, we are always happy with Jesus identifying with us in our suffering, right? I mean, we have things like, oh, what would I do without Jesus? How would I have made it through COVID without Jesus? How would have I had made it through a cancer diagnosis without Jesus? We love it for Jesus to identify with us in our suffering. But how often do we despise identifying with Jesus in his suffering, friends? And may it not be so of us. And that's the point of Peter is like, hey, like when you suffer for the sake of Christ, like the Spirit of God rests upon you, and it is good. And it is worth it. And it is a call to suffer for Christ because he is worth it. I think that's going to be good for 1 Peter. Let's look at 2 Peter. So on the one hand, 1 Peter talked about how to handle persecution when it arises outside the church. Now 2 Peter is going to talk about how to undergo persecution when it arises inside the church. So the problem in 2 Peter isn't that people are persecuting us from the outside. The problem is that there is danger from within, and we learn that these are false teachers. So we had the same author around the same setting, churches of Asia Minor around the same date, and here, let's see here. So we have false teachers. He calls them false prophets who are entering in with destructive heresies. They're not just entering in with destructive heresies. They're teaching false ethics, and those things often go together. Just as James said, true religion leads to true ethics. We learn in 2 Peter that false theology leads to false ethics. It leads to partying. It leads to drunkenness. It leads to all kinds of shameful activities we learn about in 1 Peter chapter 2. And Peter is warning against these false teachers. We also see some other tenets, including his theology of Scripture, which is super, super significant. And the idea of the day of the Lord. The idea of the day of the Lord is that God is coming back, and we must be ready. On the one hand, it could be a very terrifying reality, but on the other hand, it can be a glorious reality. And it all comes down to how are we going to deal with the dangers that arise from inside the church. That's 2 Peter's point. It's that the dangers that arise from within are significant. False teachers who teach faulty doctrine. False teachers who say you can indulge in sin and be safe. Like, the way we handle this, friends, will affect how we respond on the day of the Lord. And Peter's encouragement is that we would make our calling and election sure by adding to our faith beautiful Christian virtues, friends. So may we be the kind of people who respond well to persecution and danger that arises outside the church. That's 1 Peter. May we be the kind of people who respond well to danger arising from within the church. That's 2 Peter. And let that be enough for 1 and 2 Peter.